Good evening, everyone. I'm Karen Hutt. I'm one of the ministers at First Universalist Church, and welcome to our midweek cool down. 3 breaths, take a minute, chill out, stop, pause. That's what we have to do tonight. Just take a minute. And thanks for taking the time to come here to this little spot on the Zoom machine where we try to lift up an idea, a thought, a feeling to give you a little something to chew on for the rest of the week until we see you hopefully on Sunday for our worship services at 9 and 11 in the church. So yes, we are back in the church and we're also here online on Sunday as well. So there are 3 times that you can get engaged in the church, 9, 11, or whenever you want to. You can look at it on YouTube. So I want to remind you all too, as things are starting to open up everywhere, we still want to make sure that we stay connected, getting outside, meeting friends, renewing relationships. This is all part of what we are moving towards in the spring as we see these COVID rates come down and people are engaging in outdoor activities and meeting with friends and loved ones. Today, I want to have you go and find a place for some light. Maybe your challenge is just turning on the electric light in your room or the lamp right there by your bedside. But we're going to light the chalice as soon as you get one. And I'm going to invite you to, even if you have a candle or a chalice in your mind, and think about it for a second as we read our covenant words together. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. I'd like to start by reading a blurb, a poem, a thought from William Stafford. It's called A Ritual to Read to Each Other. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible eras of childhood, storming out to play through the broken die. And as elephants parade holding each other's tails, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs, but not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. Though we could fool each other, we should consider lest the parade of our mutual life get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is indeed deep. Now, I'm going to make a bold statement. I've never known to do that, but I'm going to try right now. I'm going to make a bold statement. We need to stop writing covenants. Yep. Hear me out now, just for a minute. I know we're a covenantal faith, which means that we make an agreement to come together to engage in mutual promises with mystery, other people, and communities. But tell me if any of this sounds familiar. Now, I've gathered these little vignettes here from my work as a Unitarian Universalist minister and as a minister who works for the national church doing investigations about what's going on in different churches. And these are some of the things I've seen in our churches around the country. Someone breaks the covenant, But everyone excuses the breach as, oh, that's just Bob. New people are asked to sign the congregation's covenant before they know what is in the covenant or even what a covenant is. Members in power in some churches use breaches in the behavioral covenant to punish those they don't like or to not reconcile. I've seen this in a church that I used to attend in Boston. Significant donors would demand to have things done their way, or they'll resign their membership or withdraw their pledge. A congregation I knew in Chicago, a congregation brings concerns about a minister's conduct to a regional or denominational body, but there's no resolution or reconciliation. A regional or denominational body asks congregations to take up a major justice issue, but doesn't give us support for it, thus creating what we call in the government an unfunded mandate. We affirm and promote the 7 principles, but only as far as we're comfortable, often excluding people for their skin color, their gender, their sexuality, their class, their ability, or even their religious postures. And these are just a few examples that happen across the board in all religious communities rooted in covenant. So, what is a covenant for if we aren't going to actually use them as they are meant to be used, to hold one another in relationship? No wonder our circus can't find a park. I wonder why this is, why we regularly break the covenants we create. I'm going to raise my hand too. I've done it. And while we get back the courage to try to get back right, I think we need to start with the simple fact that people want to fit in to a new group. And often we figure we learn the jargon and the meaning of things through assimilation. We'll just kind of go along with the idea, but we're not really rooted in it. We hear the words covenant and chalice and principles and figure eventually we'll understand what they really mean if we hang around long enough. That's kind of how I got into Unitarian Universalism. I started to hang around long enough. I remember going through in high school an entire year of chemistry before I had the guts to ask a teacher what a mole was and what Avogadro's number had to do with it. By the time May rolled around, I think I finally asked the question and it was explained to me. And well, it was like the clouds parting and the angels singing. I finally understood what it was. Now, the experience I had at age 16 is the same many of us have when we become Unitarian Universalists and when we become particularly parts of congregations. We don't often know what the words really mean or where they come from, and we're often too shy or too deep into it to ask. So, what is covenant? A promise, a commitment, a bond. Comes from the ancient world. We remember as children, the first covenant we probably learned about was the covenant that of God and Noah, Abraham and God, Moses and God. God makes covenants. People make covenants with one another. Marriage is a covenant. It takes courage to create covenant, and that creation has to be driven by everyone. It can't be driven by the people in power, whether that's a positional power like boards or religious professionals, or systemic power like white people or the top donors. The process has to be courageous enough to include all of the voices making the covenant, all of those who have agreed to freely come together in the process of creating and living that covenant out. It takes courage to write a covenant that actually treats everyone like a person with the inherent worth and dignity that they deserve. It takes courage to see covenant not as yes or no, but as yes and. In a world where we must often choose, and it's really sad, we often have to choose between these false binaries, like this or that, yes or no, good or evil, friend or foe, black or white. Covenant suggests that there are multiple choices that may all be true at the same time. multiple choices in a covenant that may all be true at the same time. Covenant asks us to look for possibility, to say yes, and this too. Let's take this too. It takes courage to covenant, especially when a covenant is broken. Covenant audaciously says, come back anyway. We've made this commitment to each other. Come back anywhere. I trust you. I love you. I need you. I made a promise to you that I cannot break because of this one breach. Let us make room for this mistake, this misunderstanding. We must be courageous enough to not forsake our own covenant with our own principles as well. As Stafford's poem says, if we stop holding each other's tails, we wander, even when we know that it's happening. How many times have you seen people holding each other's tails, knowing they're going in the wrong direction, wandering, afraid to take that step, afraid to live in, afraid to speak what needs to be said about the covenant being broken, or the covenant healing, or the covenant being returned? He says too, it's important that awake people be awake. I love that. Important that wake people be awake. We are awake. Everybody talks about being woke, but we are awake people. To be awake in our covenant means an extra kind of awareness to certain nuances in relationships. And it takes work. We must be awake to the fears and anxieties that keep us from forming real, strong, accountable covenants with one another. Covenant, whether it's a tiny little group like we have at church, when small groups gather, or whether it's the whole congregation, all 1,000 and such of us, whether it's the whole denomination of Unitarian Universalism, or a whole beloved city, or a country, or a state, it requires us all to be accountable and responsible, to negotiate and compromise, even as the covenant remains in place. The covenant can hold us. It can hold our angst. It can hold our anxiety, because that's okay. It isn't a sign that the covenant is weak when we disagree, but it's a sign rather that it's strong, that it can bend and not break. We should always be re-examining our covenants to embrace the reality, not just the idea of every person making room for the reality, not just the idea of every person's color or sexuality or gender or ability or economic status, but ultimately, when we approach covenant with respect, shared awe, and open-heartedness, covenanting together means we are greater than the sum of our parts and stronger together, even when something breaks down. Even when something breaks down. How many of you have had relationships break down where you think there was no way back to that friendship, to that romance, to that partner, to that adult child? How many of you have thought that there's no way that we can rebuild again? And something happens, an opening is made, a reminder, a flicker of the covenant is reborn right before you in a phone call, a letter, a flower pot on your porch. Inevitably, if we want to, it will. So I take back what I said at the beginning. I'm wrong about my original proposal. If there are no objections, I'd like to retract and revise my original statement. My new bold statement is this: we must actually have the courage to get close. I know we've been separated for the last 2 years, but now it's time to get close in a new way with one another, to know one another, so that covenant means something. Think about someone in your life that you need to re-covenant with. Even if we covenant with people who don't look like us, or act like us or love like us. Let's have some courage this week to commit to one another, to trust one another, to be deeply connected to our souls, and to consciously covenant in the healing. There's no better place to do healing than in covenant. We always like to say that come, come again, come through, come again, come, though we've broken our vows 1,000 times. We may be wanderers, worshipers, and lovers of leaving, but instead we must courageously say, come, come, yet again, come. Blessed be, and amen.